I have a mess, I think. I promise this isn't clickbait. Welcome to Slow Roll. My name is Stephanie. Videos on disability every Wednesday. These past few weeks have been really challenging, and I promise you, once I've told you this story, you may have a better understanding of what I mean when I say I have MS. Now, here is the reality and the truth. I won't leave the elephant in the room any longer. No, I have not gotten an official MS diagnosis. The only way to do that is to have an MRI show a lesion on your brain. And a lesion is essentially a breakdown of cells that happens in the brain. It is the only form of official diagnosis of MS in the world, as far as I'm aware, and it's the only way you can officially be diagnosed with MS. But here's what you need to know. A lot of studying of MS until recently, in the last 5 years or so, has primarily been diagnosed in men. And their very first symptoms, for the most part, is a lesion on the brain. This was some of the original studying that was done on MS. And the reality is it affects typically more women than men. And here in Manitoba, we have one of the largest concentrations of MS in the world. We still don't know why, but there are a lot of resources and a lot of knowledge here in Manitoba surrounding MS. And I myself have done a lot of research, as well as my family doctor, and have spoken to my doctors thoroughly in regards to this. Now let's backtrack a little bit. My journey officially started back in 2016 when I had what we called a fainting spell. Now, fast forward 7 years and we are still in the midst of an unknown madness of symptoms and issues, and still no official diagnosis. I do have Crohn's disease, but that's its own set of issues and doesn't really deal with the neurology symptoms I have. Recently, I spoke to you guys about my EEG and us trying to get me diagnosed with a seizure disorder. Now, I've had this EEG, and these last 2 weeks have really brought on some really complicated thoughts surrounding my diagnosis and the future of my health. We don't really know what the next month is gonna look like, let alone what the next 5 years are. I am having a really hard time managing the emotional side of what the EEG has brought on. And this is something that pretty much happens to me every time we decide to do a test and decide to give it an emotional backing. I try not do this, but when you wait months upon months for these really critical tests that should have been done in 2016 when I was first sick, it's really hard to keep the emotions down. I officially requested the EEG with my neurologist in March. We received the letter in August, and after some additional complication, I finally received my test a few weeks ago and finally got the results 2 weeks back. Now, I actually met with my family doctor first, and she is incredible and I love her to bits and pieces. And she actually was able to sit down with me early to look over my results before I met with my neurologist. I do try and do this as much as possible because knowing what my family doctor has to say prior to seeing a specialist really gives me and empowers me with a lot of information and ensures that I ask the neurologist, who I only get to see every 6 months, as many questions as humanly possible to be able to get as far into my journey as fast as possible. It's a skill that is hard to master, trying to make sure that everything is scheduled properly, but we do our best. Meeting with my doctor first, we went over the results of my EEG, which is done and reviewed by a neurologist. We've got some really cool photos that will pop up showing you exactly what the tests look like. EEG is pretty simple. It takes about an hour. Honestly, the longest part is the setup and the removing of all the electrodes on your brain. Essentially, the electrodes allowed the tech to look at the brain waves, where they're coming from, what hemisphere, and whether or not there's any essentially glitches in the matrix of your brain. The results came back negative and or normal. I do not have epilepsy, and I do not suffer from an epileptic seizure disorder. Now, we kind of knew this already, but we were hoping that something was going to show on the EEG so that my doctors could look at that and be like, yes, this seizure disorder may not be epileptic in nature, but is an actual seizure disorder, and we can start treating that and hopefully she'll start feeling better. Unfortunately, with this negative result for us, normal in the wording of this, the reality then turned to what's next. And my family doctor and I sat down and really had to hash out what the heck we were going to do next. It is the second time we've gone through this in major over the last 7 years, waiting for some major test result to come back, and every single time coming back quote unquote normal. It really starts breaking down the way you feel and how to manage really not knowing the way forward. The day of my EEG was truly a challenging day in itself. As I went into the room where I had my EEG, I realized that back in 2016, I actually came to this room before in the St. B hospital where I was for 2.5 weeks, and realized that some of the first tests I ever had after my first fainting spell was actually in the same clinic. It was a vivid moment of recollection, and at the same time, kind of a time warp, because here we are 7 years later in the exact same room where we started. Now, the test did note, or the neurologist that wrote the report for the test did note, that there was a left hemispheric anomaly and that I should be sent for an MRI to check my brain via MRI. Now, we have done this 5 times already, but it was interesting to note because that could be the beginning of a lesion or something more complex happening on my left side of my hemisphere, which is essentially the left side of your brain. It also does correlate that the right side of my body actually is usually worse than my left, which is kind of an interesting thing to note. Now, after all this discussion, my doctor and I essentially sat down and I just asked her, I said, we thought I had MS when I first met her back in 2018, and obviously went for an MRI that came back normal and or negative. And here we are, fast forward, 4 years later from meeting her, and we're in the exact same spot. She proceeds to tell me that she had a patient a while back, and it took them 8 years to diagnose her with MS. This was her way of telling me that she knew the fight would be long, but she did agree with me that the possibility of me having MS and all of a sudden a lesion showing up on an MRI is something she is going to continue to pursue. Do I currently have MS? Technically, via the official process that the Manitoba government chooses to diagnose MS, I do not. But I truly believe in my heart of hearts, with all my symptoms, all the stories I've heard of people having to fight for MS diagnoses, especially young women like myself, who spent 10 years, 5 years, 7 years being sick as dogs, on disability if they were lucky, or bedridden with absolutely no support if they weren't. All of these women have since been diagnosed with MS. And I truly wanted to believe that this day was never going to come, that I was going to self-diagnose myself and put this on the internet and choose to live my life without official medical support. But here we are, at the end of 2022, doing the one thing I didn't want to do. I wanted to believe that the system was going to be there to support me and make this happen without me having to fight as hard as I have. I really don't want to say I've lost hope in this system, because I haven't. My doctors and specialists have been amazing after spending some time looking for good ones. But the ones that I do have now have been an amazing support to me. Continue to fight by my side and continue to push for the support that I need. But deep down, I also know that the system as a core has failed me. And that's due to, in part, biases in the medical system against women, biases against my age and how ageism plays a part in health, how now 7 years and some 80 pounds heavier, I am now just seen as an obese, crazy patient that thinks she just has everything under the sun. I get sideswiped and left on the wayside and pushed off and shoved to the side so much, and I truly do everything I can to fight the system that was built this way. And I hope to come on here one day and be able to tell you that I finally got that piece of paper that officially states that I have MS. And will I come on here a year from now and tell you, you know what, I was wrong, and we've actually found a completely other diagnosis? At this point, that doesn't even matter, because the reality is I have every symptom under the sun. We have tried so many different diagnoses. So many different symptoms have popped up over the last 7 years. I have degenerated, and I just hope that one day, to hope to have a disease like MS is to hope for a death sentence. And I would rather have that than continue to be in the space that I am right now with nothing, with no support from a medical standpoint for a future, or to even know what the next 6 months are going to look like. We have zero clue as to what the next 6 months of my life is going to look like. And yes, I've officially been diagnosed with 3, technically 7 different disorders, but none of them make sense, and I don't think any of them are the core of the absolute truth of what's going on with my body. And the reality is, I know my body better than anyone else does. And I wish this wasn't the future that I think holds for my body, but I do believe it's the truth. And we will see what the future holds. We will see what the future looks like and what ends up being the truth, if we ever get there. But till then, I will continue to fight. I will continue to hopefully put out some more cheery content for you guys in the coming weeks. With Christmas approaching, I am really looking forward to spending some time with family and just having some time at home and enjoying the festivities. I hope that this video makes you understand just part of my journey, and at the same time that you didn't see this as clickbait. I hope you guys have a wonderful week. We'll see you next Wednesday. Don't forget to slow your roll. If you enjoyed this video, you might enjoy one of my last emotional videos on Bell Let's Talk Day.